I'm Tristan, and this is Thinking About Politics. So today, we're thinking about the horrific violence unfolding in the Ukraine. An aggressive and imperialist Russian regime has decided to take over its neighbor, to depose the democratically elected government, and to impose one that's friendly to the Putin regime. These are early days. I'm positive things will get worse before they get better. I am sure that we will see increased violence, and it's such an unstable and unpredictable situation. It's really hard to predict what happens next. But whatever the case may be, even if the Putin regime is able to roll into Kyiv, even if they are able to inflict mass casualties, even if they are able to kill the democratically elected leadership, there is no victory for the Russian regime. And we're going to talk about this and try to convince you of the fact that whatever this looks like, for all of his apparent strength, Vladimir Putin's move here belies a real weakness. And invading Ukraine is perhaps the single greatest blunder that he has ever made. Let this be a lesson to world leaders out there. Wars of choice don't end well. So the thumbnail history of Ukraine since 1991 is that after being part of the Soviet Union, they voted for their independence and overwhelmingly decided to be independent. By 2004, there was a very close election between Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko. Yanukovych was the pro-Russian candidate, in a highly contested election. He initially won by a small margin, but there were allegations of voter fraud, voter intimidation, and ultimately a political crisis where people took to the streets and protested. Eventually, the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych resigned, and after a second election where they lost, and the Supreme Court declaring their election invalid. So that was 2004, but by 2010, Viktor Yanukovych, again, the pro-Russian candidate, failed to get a full majority of the vote, but because two other candidates split the anti-Russian opposition, Yanukovych was able to assume the presidency with only 48% support. Now, once in power, the pro-Russian Yanukovych jailed former political opponents who took part in the Orange Revolution. He pursued closer ties with Russia, and in November 2013, after failing to sign an agreement with Europe and pursuing even closer ties with Russia, protests erupted. Political leadership in Ukraine turned against him, and Viktor Yanukovych fled Ukraine. This is important. This man fled Ukraine in the face of protests by his own people. Compare that to the current president, Vladimir Zelensky, and the former president, Petro Poroshenko, both of whom remain in Kyiv despite a Russian onslaught and essentially a price on their heads. Do you see a difference in the leadership here? So in response to losing their pro-Russian plant in Kyiv, Russia essentially started a war with Ukraine. First, they annexed part of the country, Crimea. Then they started supporting political rebels in the eastern provinces. And they even had troops at one point cross the border, although they took insignia off their uniforms. So for 8 years, Russia has been trying to apply force to pull Ukraine back into their orbit. And it has failed spectacularly. More people want closer ties with Europe. More people want a modern democratic state and want to get away from the corruption of the pro-Russian clique. So after 8 years of failure, this 200,000 troop buildup on the border and then invasion of a peaceful neighbor looks pathetically weak. And it's not just the optics here. You think about it. If you're going to invade a country, right? Do you want to give them 8 years to prepare and to harden? Do you want to give them 8 years to think about how they would respond to Russian aggression in their country? No. And then just look at the economics of the thing. Wars are expensive. How long until Europe figures out how to deal with that hardship of blocking Russian exports? What will Russia do as a pariah nation? Here Russia is potentially ready to be isolated forever economically, but behind Ukraine, you have the arsenal of democracy. You have Europe and the United States ready to funnel money in and material to support these folks defending their country. And economics aside, I'm pretty struck by the resolve on display by the Ukrainian people. There's former President Peter Poroshenko with a rifle in downtown Kyiv.
Putin attacked the whole Western world. We are here fighting not only for our people, not only for our soil, but also for the freedom and for democracy.
President Zelensky remains in country, even though he is clearly the primary target of Russian aggression here.
Прем'єр-міністр Шмигаль тут, Подоляк тут, президент тут. Всі ми тут, наші військові тут, громадяни суспільства тут, всі ми тут. Захищаємо нашу незалежність, нашу державу. І так буде й далі. Слава нашим захисникам, слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні!
Prior to the invasion, there were already groups of volunteers, militias that were on the frontier, ready to harden defenses against Russian aggression, against separatist incursions. And then reports coming out of Russia of mass protests. I'm not really sure how big they are, but there's been reports of, up to 1,000 arrests across the country.
В сторону, разойдись, дорогу!
These are tremendously brave people. And it's just a reminder that this is not a war that the Russian people have made. This is not a war that the Russian people even seem to want. This is the deranged lunacy of one man, Vladimir Putin. And again, when he was sitting on the border with 200,000 troops, he had all the power in the world. He was really, making the West look bad, really doing a lot to maybe shatter our alliance. But his invasion will have the exact opposite effect. We will now be more unified in the face of Russian incursions. Russia will be isolated economically, diplomatically. This is not going to end well for them. I mean, even if you take over Kyiv, even if you install another government, these folks have voted for their independence. They've had 2 revolutions against pro-Russian governments. I'm sure they can go for another. So once a people decides to be free, it puts an oppressor in a very difficult position. Do you kill them all, or do you come to some sort of an accommodation? I mean, I keep watching reports from Ukraine. I keep trying to look for interviews with Ukrainian people, and I don't see a people who are cowed into submission. I am tremendously impressed by the resolve you keep seeing in the eyes of just regular people who are willing to go and pick up a gun and stand in front of the Russian army. And morally, spiritually, we stand with the people of Ukraine defending their country. We're praying for you. We're thinking about you. We love you. And your fight is the fight of all people who want to live and be free in this world. Anyway, that'll be it for me. You've been great. I hope to see you again next time. But until then,
I ain't got time
keep
to kiss
thinking.
you now. I'm busy with this mule.